what is the 24th consecutive St. Thomas Aquinas lecture. No rainouts, 24 straight. Back on my first term of office, by the way, I have a pleasant duty tonight of introducing Dr. Mary Catherine Summers, who will introduce our guest speaker for tonight. And back on my first run as president, one of the smartest things I did was recommend Mary Catherine for tenure. Remember that, Mary Catherine? In the honors program, no less, right? Remember that? They told me I couldn't do that, and I said, well, watch me. And now, my second time, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mary Catherine Summers, who has provided wonderful leadership at the university and the Center for Thomistic Studies, and as chairman of the philosophy department. So would you join with me in giving her a warm St. Thomas.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you all are finding seats somewhere. Our Aquinas lecturer tonight, Dr. Kenneth Schmitz, is professor of philosophy at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family in Washington, D.C., as well as emeritus professor of philosophy and fellow of Trinity College at the University of Toronto. Professor Schmitz has also taught at Loyola University of Los Angeles, Marquette, Indiana University, and the Catholic University of America. He's the past president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association and the recipient of its prestigious Aquinas Medal. In welcoming Dr. Schmitz to the University of St. Thomas and the Center for Thomistic Studies, I am not introducing a distinguished outsider, but someone who has history with us. His relationship with the Basilian Fathers reaches back to his undergraduate days at the University of Saskatchewan, where Father Henry Carr introduced him to Maritain and Gilson, and through Gilson to medieval philosophy. In his Gilson lecture of 1982, Schmitz confesses that he was not a little scandalized by the frank acknowledgement in Gilson's Spirit of Medieval Philosophy of the role played by religion in the development of that thought. However, as we know, it is good for undergraduates to be shaken up on occasion. And Schmitz went on to study with Gilson at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto, receiving his licentiate in 1952 at the Institute, and his PhD at the University of Toronto in 1953. Dr. Schmitz, like the best of that Toronto generation, combines breadth of learning and profundity of thought with the ability to speak and write at a level of elegance and clarity, which is itself a demonstration of the connection between beauty and truth. In his book, At the Center of the Human Drama, Schmitz recounts the joke that the Pope's difficult work, The Acting Person, would be required reading for priests in purgatory. Schmitz remarks that if that was true of the Polish text, the English Revised Translation, he said, must be reserved for those in even lower depths and deeper trouble. To the contrary, Schmitz's own book on John Paul II's philosophy of the human person renders this complex subject accessible without dulling or diminishing it. Tonight he will speak to us about living in a textured world woven by the threads of being, which are truth, goodness, and otherness. In his Aquinas lecture at Marquette in 1982, he explored being as bestowed by creation, God's unanswerable gift, which nevertheless makes it both possible and necessary that we give in return, both perhaps through action and discourse, which form the subjects of his current lecture. Please help me in welcoming the 2004 Aquinas lecturer, Dr. Kenneth Schmitz.
It's a joy to be here, and I hope you'll feel the same after I finish my lecture. Yes, I do have a feeling of connection. My first graduate course in philosophy was taught at Toronto by Father Brise. It was over 50 years ago, and it was on
on St. Thomas's On Being in Essence, De Ente et Essentia, and I hope I won't disgrace him in talking about metaphysics to you tonight. So the title of the lecture, as you know, is The Texture of Being, Paths of Action, Compass of Discourse. I want to talk about old friends, and I say old friends since you've known them and lived with them all your lives, what I'm going to talk about. The best known among them go by the name of the true, the good, and the beautiful. They overflow the limited categories of everyday life, and yet they are deeply embedded within it, so that they are matters of personal concern. And in opening the door to them, we come first of all upon a distinction I should make. On the one hand, we have the categories, the particular, specific, and generic names that are part of the world of our experience, our height and weight. Yes, that's always worrisome for me. Your friend's coloring or smile, the neighbor's comings and going, and in the surrounding world, every type and feature of things, the various species of animals and plants that populate the earth, the table of elements and minerals, the things we possess, and a myriad of more or less definite kinds of things that invite classification. And along with things, there are different features inasmuch as colors are not sounds, a smile is not a substance, and a square is not a circle. All of these different things and their features can be cataloged and, so to speak, put in their place as definite kinds of being. On the other hand, there are more hidden presences, great expansive swaths of meaning and value that escape confinement in categories, even as they form the hidden texture and the undercurrent of our own lives. These background presences put forward several different faces. They're known to the researcher, the scientist, the scholar, and the teacher as truth. To the saint, the social activist, the physician, and the businessman as the good. To the poet, artist, and contest organizer as beauty. And to the founder of a nation or a religion as unity. Among philosophers, they're known by the name Transcendentals, since they transcend and yet penetrate all specific types. They were a long time coming to their name day, and yet they are foreshadowed in Plato's Sophist as he sets forth the great primordial forms. And when I say that the Transcendentals make up the underlying texture of being, I mean that they are not the property of philosophers alone, but form the very web and woof of everyone's existence. They have cash value even for the evildoer, who cannot do without appealing to them. For example, the con man assures his victim that he's telling the truth. The medical quack promises that the tonic will do you good. The too eager salesperson gushers over how beautifully the suit or dress fits the customer. For these ever-present realities are so inescapable that even when they are absent, their hollow masks continue to exercise their power. And recently now, the spin masters of media, web, and political platform know their value and their power all too well. I don't quite recall how I became fascinated with them. I do know that I resisted the urgent advice of the German consular officer in Chicago years ago, who insisted that I would advance my career if I went to Frankfurt to study under the then popular Theodor Adorno, a neo-Marxist philosopher much in the news in the troubled 1960s. But I had somehow come upon the work of a less well-known philosopher, one Eugen Fink, one-time assistant to the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, and at the time I studied with him, colleague of Martin Heidegger. The title of his book was Sein, Wahrheit, Welt, Being, Truth, and World. It was a fundamental cosmology in the phenomenological manner, but it was the first two words that caught my fancy. Being, truth. My old friends were hiding there. How could I not see them looking out at me, since my studies in medieval and ancient philosophy had set me on their trail? And so I set my compass on them, hoping to meet up with them in the midst of any relatives they might have within their family group. Now, since they are justly associated in the mind of many with St. Thomas Aquinas, it seems appropriate to reflect upon them in this contemplative tribute to the great philosopher, theologian, sage, whose disputed question on truth will form the background and the inspiration for my reflections. Given the seemingly abstract character of these reflections, I don't think they really are abstract, but they seem to be, and the format of the lecture, I looked around for an image that would help to hold the whole together. Since I know, when you hear these things, it's not easy to have the whole picture. I sought for an image then that would help to hold the whole thing together. For it is not so much the individual transcendentals that interest me as their combined interrelationship and the consequences that follow upon any breakdown of their matrix, both for our personal life and the life of our society. To think of them together as a portrait is supported by St. Thomas, who tells us that God created the world, this is quite striking, in order to communicate his beauty. That's one of those transcendentals. Then again, I thought of a labyrinthian maze, since we're in the middle of them, since the web and woof of truth, beauty, and goodness gives rise to that amazement from which philosophy itself is born. For the most part, however, I will use the image of the interwoven threads of a carpet, the patterned figures and colors imaging the surface categories, and the woven threads making up the underlying fabric that constitutes the texture of being. Now, since then, I came upon a much more up-to-date image from the computers, and that would be that the software is like the categories, and the hardware is like the underlying transcendentals that operate the whole system. But then I thought of how old I am, and I thought I'd better stick with the carpet. So first of all, I come to the first of them. The first thread in this fabric, this carpet of reality. At the center and core is what Thomas calls being. The Latin word is ens, of course. The mind has to stretch, however, in order to entertain what Thomas means by this term. He tells us that everything that falls within the attention of the human mind is being. But his reflection does not rest there, for being is at once a familiar and yet almost a most unusual term, reaching as it does both outwards to the farthest horizon, as it embraces everything that is or that has any relation at all to that which is, while at the same time this being reaches most intimately downwards and inwards and upwards to the tips and the depths and the interiority of all that is. We must not make the mistake that Kant made of identifying being primarily with its extension alone. For being is also the most intimate and interior factor in all that is. In the technical words of logic, being has absolute comprehension, embracing each and everything, so that nothing that is falls wholly outside of being, since then it would not be. And yet being is more than an empty circumference. While it does provide the broadest conceivable horizon, at the same time its energy penetrates most deeply within the interior parts and constituents of each thing. Even those things that are not yet but can be, like your wish-for holiday, or a thing that may never be, like your lottery win, are brought under the umbrella of being and take their measure and their meaning from that relation. This dual aspect of comprehension and intention or intimacy manifests the vital tension that characterizes being. It is as though we are both on and in a great sea, awash in its waves and caught up in its currents. It is this dynamic tension that absorbs both sameness and difference within it, both unity and diversity, sameness and otherness. Only being has such outreach and such depth, not simply as a generalized word, but as a reality that has the power by which everything that exists stands above and beyond the abyss of nothingness. To be or not to be, not with Hamlet to be the future king of Denmark or a patricide, but simply to be rather than not, This is the primordial sense of being. Some languages may not have a distinctive term for its omnipresence, but every mind is somehow aware of it. Since every mind instinctively knows the radical difference between existence and non-existence, we recognize this difference in both the littlest and in the greatest events of our lives. As when, for example, and it's a common experience for me, a plant expires under my black thumb. Or an apple, having been eaten, is no longer available as an apple, even though its particles are. But you can't eat the same apple twice. Aristotle tended to think of that loss as a relative loss of being. But for the apple, and a still hungry appetite, the loss is absolute. More importantly, we lament the loss of the insurance papers, which have gone up in smoke. And most sadly, the friend who was lost to death. Aristotle recognized this principle as energeia, and was the first to adumbrate it in the context of coming to be. As I consider the principle of actual existence, I am almost tempted to call it the workhorse of the universe, but that would be too much, or rather too little, since it also makes room for play. It has the lightness of wind and the heaviness of earth. It is present in action and at rest. It can surge up as determined effect, but also as open freedom. To repeat, the root of this energy that wells up from the interior of each being, you included, and from being itself, deserves the dynamic name which the medieval Latins gave it, esse, E-S-S-E. It's the infinitive of the verb to be, and awkwardly and literally rendered verbally in English as the to be of something, and more fully as the very act of being, the actus essendi. Such being is the primal energy of the universe. This is more than a factual state of affairs, a set of conditions. It is nothing less than the power to be rather than not. And our medieval forebears wondered, as did some later philosophers, at the enormity of the watershed between being and not being. As long as ancient philosophers assumed the cosmos to be eternal, always there, ungenerated, they softened their wonder, since it stopped short at the allegedly ungenerated cosmos. As the sense of contingency grew, however, remember contingency means you can be or not be. As the sense of contingency grew with deeper inquiry, however, the enormity of sheer existence engaged the mind. And in the early modernity, Leibniz was to ask, why anything at all? Why not rather nothing? And Heidegger was to repeat the question in his own fashion. When the mind forgets its busyness among the categories, the forms and modes of being, the mind is stunned for a while in the face of such a question. But then the pace of life catches up with it. However, in that quiet moment, philosophy is born again, as the mind stills its tongue and, so to speak, falls upon its knees in the silence of contemplation. To pause in that wonder, that thaumazein, that is the beginning of philosophy. For philosophy begins in silence. And then once again, that same energy of being rises up within the mind to bring forth words of wonder and praise at the marvel of simply being. To be sure, we never meet being as such and in its purity, except in thought, as I was doing just now. Because in our everyday encounters, we meet much more than a word or an idea. We meet being in reality, always formed, always structured or patterned in some way, always bearing a distinctive nature as water or flesh or a spoken word, so that Thomas recognized that being presents itself always under a double aspect. First, as the actuality of a primordial energy, energeia, actus, he uses those terms, and that's what I've been speaking of as the primal energy, but also as endowed with a way of existing and acting, that is, as possessing a nature or essence. Being, he recognized, as two sides, the one actual, the other formal, and he called these esse for the actual and essentia for the structural. the actuality of being, and the formality of essence. So that's the first of these hidden presences. And they're not completely hidden, but they're the underlying presences, I think, of our life and of all reality. And so now I pick up the second thread in this carpet of the texture of being. Whenever we encounter a being, we come upon these two sides I mentioned. We have two words for this difference in emphasis. We call something a being when we emphasize the actuality of its existing. And when we call it a thing, res is the Latin term, we express the form, essence, or nature, the modality or way in which the thing exists. As a being, it answers to the question, is it unseen? And as having an essence or nature, it answers to the question, what is it? Quid it? Now it is by virtue of the formal aspect, the structural aspect of being, the essence, that what Thomas calls natural law is grounded, and upon which positive law is rightly founded. Moreover, essence is the focus of the intelligibility and the meaning of all things. But the ground of their being, not merely of their meaning, but of their being at all, is this energy of existence, esse. Now it's noteworthy in St. Thomas that all the other aspects of being, what a thing is, its features and its activity, are brought back to and receive the dynamism of their properties from that inner Gaia, that existence that is the inner source of its being. As the last interior resource, esse accounts for and grounds everything. Speaking sparingly as a philosopher, without the rich vocabulary of symbols, metaphors, and imagery contained in the sacred scriptures, Thomas calls God by the seemingly bald philosophical name, pure act, being itself, ipsum esse subsistens. And he tells us that only in God are these two sides, essence and existence, identical. By participation and imitation, however, esse, existence, is the dynamic nerve intimately present in every created being. It's transformal, not because it's formless, but because it is most formal, more formal than any form or structure. Formalissime, he calls it. The act of existence is beyond the determinacy of form, is hyperdeterminate. It is the primal electricity of the universe. So far, then, we've considered essence, the structure, and existence, the dynamism, the dynamic principle. The first two threads of our fabric of being. And now Thomas adds yet another, a third. For both essence and esse are included in the reality of a single unified being. Any one being has both of these sides, but it has them as a single being. In the beings we encounter, then, being and essence are unseparated, and yet they're distinct. This is not easy for us, since the nominalism ingrained in modern thought tends to equate all difference or distinction with separation or separability, the model being the separation of chemical elements. Traditional metaphysics, on the other hand, builds upon distinctions, some of which are notional, as the Transcendentals, but also on some that are real, as between essence and existence, even though they are not separations. For the composition of beings differs from the composition of forces or elements. For while the beings we encounter are one in being, they are also composite beings. And so unlike the divine being, they are liable to corruption and ultimate separation, as when an apple ceases to be or we lose our full humanity in death. Given the basis of unity in being, we admire someone who has their act together, because we appreciate the importance of unity, which is the third transcendental thread in the carpet. Of course, not every togetherness is appropriate, as I'll see later on, but rather one that signals the innate convergence of those two aspects just mentioned, actuality and essence. For the unity of act and form, of actuality and essence, signals a real togetherness. We sometimes speak of a person who has style. This may not be the deepest kind of unity, but it appeals to us, as does the unity of a building or a novel. At a deeper level, we turn to someone we respect as wise for help in our confusion, because he or she can put us back in touch with the springs of reality, can reunite us with the sources of appropriate order. So that drive for unity is inherent in the two-sided nature of being and essence. Unity signals the power of integration in being, of drawing the forces of being together. Such integration confirms the identity of a being, so that unity is the primitive focus of all meaning, while esse is the root of all meaning. But the unity of the community of being, as distinct from an individual being, must be a generous identity and not a scaled-down one. It is all too easy in the contemporary thought world to reduce the richness of being to matter, to particles, or to physical forces, or to some other reductionist substitute. On the contrary, however, being embraces a community that harbors within itself the manifest diversity of all that is, stretching from the tiniest subatomic particles to the largest of the stars. More than that, it ranges from the most modest quantum to the great minds and spirits of the universe. So this unity of being is really a community of beings. It is a most generous and all-gathering unity. For the unity of being is not Spinoza's monism of substance that reduces all diversity to attributes and modes of the one substance. The unity of being is rather the community of beings, each in their own way embodying the unity of act and form of existence and essence. That is, each displaying in its own way the transcendental properties of being. So it is a community, and it's important that we see the cosmos and so on in that way. Such unity resonates throughout complex diversity, linking not only one being with another in the universe, but linking all the parts within any one being with each other, giving it its unity and identity. We too are creatures of unified diversity, and in our freedom, we are called upon to build a harmonious personhood out of the many elements with which we are set on our way. We are called to integrate our physical processes, our feelings and subconscious movements, and our intellectual insights and motivations. We are called to be a symphony of manifold unity, and we are given a head start precisely because being itself, in its native and original character, is a many in one and a one in many. Herein lies the seal of a being's identity and the promise of its meaning and value. In this identity there lies the aptness for being to receive a name, which is the focus for its meaningfulness, for its intelligibility and its knowability. If I may speak theologically regarding an insight that is suggestive for philosophy, but which belongs to theology, the highest and richest example of such diversified unity is the Trinity, in which faith tells us there resides a greater unity of divine nature than we can ever imagine, and yet also a greater distinctness of divine persons than we can ever conceive. And it is this that has led a Catholic theologian to speak of the Catholic principle as that which discloses ultimate and original difference in the highest and most perfect unity. Really a quite paradoxical notion, the Godhead. Although the philosopher cannot appropriate this insight, it has philosophical value insofar as it helps us to look at reality more keenly and to appreciate the interplay of diversity within unity, even in the beings of our experience. The technical term for such tension that gathers together both unity and diversity is analogy. That is, being embodies all its different and disparate kinds, modes, and things within its prevailing analogical community of being. So we come now, so we've had being as that dynamic energy, we've had essence as that structural principle, and now we've had the togetherness of these two, the integrating power of being. So we come now to the fourth thread in the fabric of being. The lambent generosity within this analogical expanse of being places relation and relationality at the very dynamic center. Aristotle had distinguished the category of relation, prostit, as that which joins two substances. Relationality, and the Latin term is aliquid, which would be translated as something other. Relationality, aliquid, on the other hand, plays itself out not only between two substances, but within the whole universe as the bonding that constitutes the cosmos in the community of beings. For relationality embraces all beings in their diversified unity, giving full recognition to the reality of otherness. Moreover, the most active principle sustaining the constitution of a created person is the creator, who supports and abides with the creature in its existence. And therefore, the most profound relationality the creature has is that relation to the source of his very being. This may be termed the transcendental principle of origin. Now, transcendental relationality weaves itself along three further threads, and this perhaps is a little more familiar to you, which receive the names truth, goodness, and beauty. It is truth that roots the intelligibility and meaningfulness of being and fulfills the quest for knowledge. It is the good that is at the root of the importance and value of being, which inspires desire and invites the will to unite with it. And it is beauty that shines with the splendor of being and that awakens our capacity for admiration. And by the way, I must say the chapel here is just stunning with its beauty and the suitableness for celebration. But let me take up then these last three threads, the true, the good, and the beautiful, very briefly. First of all, the truth. We tend to think today that true knowledge, truthfulness, the truthfulness of knowledge, comes about as a product of our own activity, of our own mental activity. And so it comes as a surprise to find St. Thomas reversing the order, for he notices that knowledge comes about through the prior presence of truth to the mind. Knowledge, then, is an effect of truth, not its cause. Truth first arises with the mind's encounter with being, whenever we are intelligently in tune with being, with some form of being, some situation of being. Whenever we consciously resonate with being, truth is already there and will be the cause of our knowledge. For truth is the presence of being in communion with the mind. And it is on this basis alone that genuine knowledge comes about and on which the mind formulates a judgment, statement, or proposition that affirms or denies something or other. In a word, then, truth is not the result of knowledge, but its cause. The truth of propositions occurs when we are in tune with that which is or can be. That is why the truth can perfect us with the power of conviction. It's a power that is not a physical power, but still perfects us. Indeed, it is quite remarkable that truth can perfect us even when it goes against the grain of our feelings, our expectations, and our preconceptions, as when we do not want to face it, as when we bring ourselves to recognize our failures, open ourselves to something unpleasant or lacking about ourselves. Paradoxically, truth stands up to non-being, although within the context of being insofar as the mind recognizes what is missing. It does this, however, only because it is aware of being in its never wholly absent presence. This is the basis of conscience. It is as though silence is heard against the absence of sound. It is as though shadows are seen through the light of the sun, or we find an error of computation in the midst of numbers. We need, however, to distinguish two senses of absence. There is the absence of knowledge, which is simple ignorance. But there is also the illusion of knowledge, which is the absence of truth. No longer a simple absence, but an error. The French philosopher Gabriel Marcel sensitively describes situations in which persons come face to face with unwelcome truths. They do so only by steeling themselves with a distinctive kind of courage fortified by a respect for the truth. In one instance, he describes a young couple who are parents of a severely disabled child. As they come to realize their inability to serve the good of the child, they struggle to admit that the child has to pass from their home into professional care. And with this opening to the truth of the situation, in all their pain, they recover a kind of wholeness. That's what I mean by the perfected power of truth. Or again, he describes a young man who struggles to discern whether he has a genuine call to serve in the priesthood. These are obviously moments of great personal crisis, and they call for judgment in the light of the truth. Those ancient lovers of the light of knowledge, the Greeks, understood judgment well because they called it by the word crisis. And the Latin cerno means discernment. So this is the way in which we are called to separate out the truth from the encumbrance of illusion and falsity. And painful as it may be, even in its dark light, the truth perfects us in that struggle. We might even dare to say that we receive a good, though it is far removed from the good of pleasure. We can liken the mind then to a musical instrument. Being, so to speak, plucks the strings of the mind, senses and feelings, which then resonate with a sound that matches the vibrations brought about by being. The well-disposed mind is, as it were, a sounding board for the being it encounters, if we only let being resonate within us. Propositional truth, the truth of statements, arises from ontological truth, the truth of being, as it's called. Truth in knowledge comes about through the capability of being to deliver meaning in the mode of intelligibility to an attentive and inquiring mind. So that's the first of these relational qualities. And the second is the good. We come now to the sixth thread in this fabric of being that I'm weaving. This too is a mode of relationality. It is the good, the bonum. The good can take, however, one of several forms that are well known to you. There's, first of all, the good of pleasure, the bonum delectabile, known all too well through our love of ease and sensual delight. In and of itself, it is a good appropriate to our physical, sensual, and emotional nature. Then there is the useful good, the bonum utile, the good of utility, without which we would not survive. And it is the good that meets our needs and confirms that we cannot stand alone and need the help of others and of our surroundings. Most properly human of all, however, nearest to us, is that good which completes and raises our humanity to its full potentiality. It is the properly human good, the bonum honestum. It may come to us from several quarters, our parents, teachers, friends, but it is especially associated with the use we make of our freedom, since our own development as persons in concert with others is the primary work of art to which we are called. So those are very human goods, utility, pleasure, and the moral good and the good of humanity, the perfectly human good. The highest good, the summum bonum, comes to us from sources beyond our control, and to which we are entitled to, called to respond and to receive as one receives a grace. The person of faith recognizes this great good, the summum bonum, as communion with God through his gracious gift. These are the different modes in which the transcendental good, the bonum transcendentale, presents itself, and which it embraces and penetrates. It's present in all of them. For it loans to these different kinds of good its fundamental character as another face of being, or another thread in the texture of being. It is the authentic and authenticating fullness that attends the active presence of being in each of its modes. Insofar as it addresses our appetites, whether sensual or intellectual, it offers fulfillment. But as transcendental, it overflows not only the good of pleasure and the good of utility or power, but even what is directly contributory to the good of our human nature, the bonum honestum. For we recognize the transcendental good even where it is dangerous and not good for us, where it calls us out of ourselves to a larger appreciation of the character of being, as when we see the destructive power of nature in a great storm, or the savage power of a predatory beast. Now, while the good and the true are coexistent in being, and to use St. Thomas' expression, differ in notion, their conceptual distinctness as notions affects us and addresses us in quite different ways. without detriment to their unity with being. The good not only provides the basis for utility and pleasure, but it also provides the power and perfective quality to our actions as the human good. Truth, on the other hand, has the remarkable capacity to enter into the relative absence of being, to pass beyond its light into the shadow that the loss of being casts without quite extinguishing the light. This tells us that the power to perfect us that is resident in truth is not to be understood in the same way as the power of the good that draws us towards communion with it. It is a subtle point. The perfective power of the good is achieved through possession or union, whereas the perfective power of the true is normative, after the manner of a wise counselor. Here we have the paths of action prompted by the promise of the good and the compass of discourse opened to us by the truth. If the good has the capacity to draw us towards truth, the true equally guides us towards the good, since they are one in being. In St. Thomas's terms, we might say that what is characteristic of the good is its appetitive power, its desirability, and of the true, its cognitive power, its intelligibility. Both, however, meet in the reality and the unity of being, which in its richness plays out two distinct roles, one in the field of knowledge and the other in the field of action. So then there remains the last one. So we've had dynamism of being, the structure of essence, we've had the unity of the two, and we have had the otherness that is found in the community of beings, and then we've had the true and the good, and you'll be perhaps thankful that there remains only one last, but by no means least, thread in the tapestry of being, this carpet that I'm weaving. It is the transcendental beauty, or pulchrum. Thomas provides an initial descriptive or nominal definition. He says, beauty is that which upon being seen pleases, id quod visum placet. But this is only an initial indicator. First of all, there is not only beauty of vision, but as in music, beauty of sound and voice, in the dance, beauty of movement and gesture, and in a holy and virtuous life, the beauty of grace. But even more than this, the term beauty itself needs some reflection. If we were to speak of the beauty of Antigone's unpleasant death, we might rather want to call it nobility. We must not tie the excellence of this transcendental beauty too closely to that which in current English suggests something pleasant or pretty, since there is something greatly attractive and even sublime in the powerful force of a destructive storm. In art too, and not only in modern art, the artist often slips the bond of conventional or representational form and prettiness. So let us look again at the excellence called transcendental beauty or transcendental pulchrum. And here Thomas comes to our aid, for he moves to ponder this transcendental property of being. And as he does so, he sets forth three primary features of what we call beauty, which are inseparable from beauty or pulchrum and which constitute its ontological character, its character as being. We encounter beauty at several levels. First characteristic, the most obvious, is the surface charm that strikes the eye or ear and stirs the feelings. But beauty also offers itself to the mind, still charms the mind, to be understood and celebrated. This is most notable in the frequency with which mathematicians use the term to describe their joy in the contemplation of that which is invisible to all but the mind. For what they admire is not the chalk equation on the blackboard, but the sublime order and pristine clarity of the interrelated numerical values. And so we come upon the first feature of beauty, its radiance or clarity. The Latin term is claritas. The capacity to hold us before it in an admiring stance, not quite possessing it as we might possess a good, and yet taking attentive joy in its presence. When rightly disposed, we are held in a trance-like admiration before a splendidly vivid sunset. I just saw one over Lake Erie recently, and it was just shattered. Or we've been moved to near ecstasy by a rush of symphonic sound. We thereby recognize in the beautiful a kind of object of admiration, not to possess it, but to share our admiration of it with others in a community of appreciative regard. So that's the first character of beauty. It's brilliance or clarity, it's charm. Intrinsic to that radiance, which strikes us, so to speak, from afar, is the internal order of the parts and aspects, the inner harmony or proportion of that which draws us to admire it. In the presence of a natural beauty, we are struck with an intimate order that composes the scene, a harmony that lends its gracious luminosity to the object of our admiration. No matter how far we are stretched by the unfamiliar, in a well-made work of art, for example, we are moved to experience a certain rightness that we hear also in a well-performed symphony, a graceful dance, a well-composed painting, and above all, in a well-directed life. The parts, aspects, and stages fit together, even if they draw upon the contrasting tension of their parts, as when silence falls after a bird song, or the ugly enhances a painting by its contrast. We encounter an unusual satisfaction in the presence of great works of art, and even of dramatic portrayals that express the conflict of pain and pleasure, sadness and joy, freedom and free decision and inevitable consequences, happy fortune and ill outcome of good in contest with evil. Such tension, in fact, the third form of Tolkien's film is full of this. Such tension is of the essence of the dramas in which we find a distinctive kind of fulfillment and rest, even perhaps especially in tragedy. The great Greek tragedies still hold us in thrall, not simply because of the dark suffering of the hero, but because the affliction has been borne with noble and grace-filled fortitude. There is here then the mingling of the good and the beautiful, and we are far removed from the pretty. Such fulfillment comes to us, no doubt, because the beautiful is marked by a certain wholeness or integrity. So if charm, brilliance, clarity is the first feature, of proportion and inner harmony is the next, the third is this sense of wholeness or integrity, a fullness that spells completion and that gives us a sense of arrival and rest. It is a provisional rest that returns us to the unity of being. Nothing except the summum bonum, who is God himself, can give us final and fulfilled rest, so that each experience of beauty is as a brief halting place on the open journey to a fullness that leads beyond us and beyond our powers to fulfill. That is why painters continue to paint and admirers to admire. For the face of beauty shines with the promise of a plenitude that leads us into the very heart and pulse of being. Well then, these are the threads woven into the fabric of being, the pristine texture of being as it issues from the Creator. The beings we encounter in the concrete are not, however, quite pristine, though the basic texture survives the onslaught of imperfection and loss. Nevertheless, various degrees of disintegration occur that in closing I want to set forth briefly. Because the portrait has lost some of its pristine character, the fabric of the carpet has become somewhat worn. As Christians, we think of the original sin that brought evil into the human world. But even Plato before us spoke of the myth of the great fall, in which he acknowledged a certain distortion and deformity on the face of being. So I wanted to spend a moment or two, a very brief time, talking about that. To theologians, these deformities and distortions are the wages of sin, and to the philosophers, they are the pain of loss and privation. But here some distinctions are unavoidable, since not all limitations are loss or privation. I've already remarked upon the limitations that always accompany each being that we encounter, the categories. Limitations not unfamiliar to us. These limitations are certainly not in themselves evil, but on the contrary, they serve a positive role as the intrinsic and essential categorical conditions of every finite being. They are constitutive of the very nature and mode of each individual and type of being. But we also encounter actual distortion in the form of evil. Insofar as evil is a blight upon being, philosophers have spoken of it as a privation. This does not lessen the calamity of such a loss. It is as though evil is an open wound resident in being. For privation is not simple absence, as when horses cannot fly, they don't expect it. Privation is rather the absence of what is rightly expected to be present, as when a trusted friend betrays us, or a young person is taken in death. Not all evil is personal, so close to home, of course. Indeed, traditionally, philosophers have distinguished evils brought about by natural forces from evil brought about by wrongdoing committed by human action, since they bear a different quality, the one deriving from the forces of nature, the other from human will. The distinction acknowledges a great difference between natural evils such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and natural disasters, and the wrongdoing of human agents, including those quasi-natural disasters that are brought about by human actions such as pollution and desertification, and maybe global warming, who knows. As to natural evils, including unintended accidents brought about by natural forces, by fires and floods, earthquakes and avalanches, presumably these could be eliminated only by withdrawing from limited beings the semi-autonomous initiative appropriate to them, thus depriving them of their proper nature, dignity, and being, which in following out their active nature come into conflict with one another, as when wolves eat sheep, a gain for the wolf, but a loss for the sheep. I dare to say that the Greek vision of the ordered cosmos still prevails, and that its expression has not been improved upon since Anaximander's maxim, by which it is said that the things of nature serve the good of the whole and must often pass away to secure what he called cosmic justice. Forest fires may be good for the renewal of the woods, but not for those settled in their midst. But what is more important and more relevant to us, however, is the evil that comes about through our own agency and over which we have control, as it bears upon the texture of being. For the transcendental properties of being form a manifold that is meant to hold together as the many facets of a diamond. And just as if the facets of a diamond were to separate out from one another, so too, being loses its meaning, value, and beauty as it loses its manifold unity. This is the sense of the maxim being and unity are co-present, that is convertible. This challenges us to become wise and to hold these transcendental aspects of being together in our own lives as far as possible, since their togetherness has the power to perfect us in our human being. I will conclude then by very briefly suggesting the effects of a disintegration of being in our own lives, as the carpet might come unraveled, and in that of the society in which we live. Each transcendental thread is so powerful that it can elicit an exclusive response that draws us away from the full fabric of being. The carpet then unravels in our own lives. A brief review of the recent history of philosophy serves to illustrate the tendency towards such disintegration. First, if existence is separated, take that first transcendental, is separated from essence and is taken in disjunction from our nature and from the nature of things, we have something like Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, in which existential choice overrides the essential structure and nature of things. Nor is this disjunction limited to esoteric philosophies. A mindless attempt at genetic reconstruction of the human species arises out of the rejection of any overall normative guidance provided by the law and structure of human nature. Or again, in the opposite direction, the exclusive focus on essence, on structure, may contribute to an unreality, an unrealism that gives to possibility and to possible worlds equal reality with the world in which we live and have our being. I'm doing this very briefly, but I just want to go through each of them and show how if they come apart from the fabric, well, then that affects our own lives and the way we relate to reality. Consider the falsification of unity. This may be even clearer. Given the totalitarianisms of the past century, we know all too well that a false conception of unity, being as undivided, may be abused if it is sought without respect for the intrinsic relationality or otherness, the aliquid, that constitutes the community of being. The most obvious manifestation of such an abuse is found even today in various forms of ideology and fanaticism. And we hear plenty of that on the television, bearing the false names of nationalism and religion. But it is found in less obvious form also among us in the demand for conformity to current cultural values that dismisses any serious differences as threatening, and democracy is especially vulnerable to such political correctness. On the other hand, we have recently seen among some postmodern philosophers such as Jacques Derrida, not an obsession with a false kind of oppressive kind of unity, but rather an obsession with disunity. He has a neologism, he speaks of différance, which eschews unity. No doubt this fear of unity has been brought about by the calamitous experience during the past century of a series of oppressive political regimes with their violent endorsement of a forced unity. Such a repressive sense of totality fails to take seriously the inseparable feature of otherness and unity, that aliquid, that something other, that relationality that is constitutive of even the highest analogical expression of being, even if we can speak out of faith, even in the Trinity. But the most intense distortion affects the three relational features: truth, goodness, and beauty, since these in many ways are central to human action, to the way we make use of our freedom, and so they touch us most deeply. The philosophers cannot speak of sin, but as already mentioned, even Plato speaks of a great fall. At any rate, the philosopher can speak to the present condition of non-being that is resident within the beings we encounter. Consider the various forms of the good that I went through briefly, that can be dissociated from their transcendental togetherness, as threads come apart in the fabric of a carpet. Consider the good conceived exclusively in terms of duty. There's a certain nobility in Kant's celebration of the moral good in the form of reverence for the law of reason, for duty. But the price he pays is too high, for in purging the dutiful good from all association with our physical and emotional nature, he not only divides us from ourselves, but he also loses the full power of the good to perfect all aspects of our humanity. Or to the contrary, consider the primacy of the good of utility. John Stuart Mill insisted upon the useful good, the highest good, but he restricted rational discourse to the determination of means, and in this way he separated the useful good, the bonum utile, from that good which could exercise direct and perfective power with regard to the human good, the bonum enestum, as an end to be attained. Or again, the good of pleasure. Marquis de Sade extolled the good of pleasure, and in particular the pleasure of sexual perversion. Or still again, not a few statesmen, from Greek tyrants to modern dictators, have given exclusive value to the good of power, to the detriment of the government. What these distortions share is the divorce from the full concert and fabric of being, from that community of being. We find a similar disjunction with regard to the transcendental truth. If we let truth lose its foothold in the texture of being, if it is taken as mere fact, we float on the surface of being like Mr. Gradgrind in Dickens' Bleak House. Just the facts, sir, and nothing but the facts. Well, we need the truth of factual reality, but we need much more besides, for being has an inner depth. On the other hand, the philosophical movement called positivism, in both its French version, Auguste Comte, and its Anglo-American form, Alfred J. Eyre, sought to keep rational discourse within narrow limits. This disjunction has sometimes been expressed as the distinction between objective fact and subjective value, thus relegating the good to a merely arbitrary or subjective import. In still another variant of the separation of truth from the ontological context that it shares with the other transcendentals, we can adopt an attitude of indifference with regard to our surroundings and become mere spectators, uninvolved observers of the drama of life. But if the texture of being as set forth above is true, then the root of our value judgments is already present in the good we encounter, so that we are called by being to emerge out of our indifference. Now, some such similar divorce occurs when beauty is disengaged from the fabric of being. Kierkegaard noted this when he depicted the style of life practiced by the aesthete as the lowest of three levels, below that of moral life and religious life. Such an attitude is encapsulated in the motto, art for art's sake. For this does not simply defend the legitimate integrity of art, but separates it from beauty from its fuller context. In all of these dislocations, we need to consider the balance of wisdom. This need not lead to compromise and consequent mediocrity, as though having lost all special interest in one or another of these transcendentals, we are good at nothing. We have known persons who are noteworthy and admired for their single-minded devotion to one or another of these transcendentals. It is a question of what that single-mindedness is and how they go about it. Indeed, some such priority setting and concentration seems necessary for the best use of each individual's talents. The artist who is not enthralled by clarity, proportion, and integrity, that is, say, the features of beauty, is probably a half-hearted artist. The practitioner of government who does not pursue the levers of power will prove indecisive and ineffective. And the scholar who does not investigate the intricacy of events and situations with a passion will fall short of the truth they have to offer. It is a question of content. Wisdom is not a cruel mistress who demands the abandonment of intense emphasis upon one or another of the transcendental properties, upon truth or goodness or beauty, according to our interest, disposition, and ability. But in all humility, wisdom simply asks that such an interest and devotion be pursued within the broad context to which our humanity calls us. And that context is the fabric of being. If a philosopher might be permitted to borrow from Scripture, wisdom is a spirit, a friend to man, a reflection of the eternal life. More philosophically, Thomas says that wisdom is that which orders all things well. Now, the transcendentals are the thread of that fabric of being that provides us with the pattern that wisdom weaves in the compass of our discourse and guides us in the paths of our action. Truth in discourse, the good in action, beauty in celebration, and unity that respects otherness, this is the texture of being as it comes forth from the source of being. It is within us, beyond us, around us. We are called to seek it out. It provides us with a compass for discourse and a guiding path for action as we respond to the being that we are and may become. The transcendental properties of being provide the light and the warmth for the perfection of our humanity. Thank you very much.
We probably have time for a question or two if you're...
Oh, fine, fine, if I can answer them, yes.
Somebody said, uh-oh.
Was that directed to you or to me?
And me. The threads that you so marvelously sketched, that have the texture of being, would you mind applying your analysis to one particular being? And I was thinking of a being whom you know about very well, but you haven't mentioned tonight, and that is the present Pope, John Paul II. Would you mind analyzing him in terms of these threads?
All right. Well, what I begin with would be with unity, because what's a big thing for him, unity and otherness. That the human person, each of us, is really a combination of unity, an interaction of unity and otherness. We have our physical processes, headaches and indigestion and good breathing and all of that. We have our emotional life. We have our subconscious. And we have our intellectual life, and we have our voluntary life. And all of those are different dimensions in the one human personality. And we are our first work of art. And we are called to integration. And he's very good at this. This is in the Osubi Chin, the acting person, where, yes, we are all there with the help of others, parents and teachers, and the use of our own freedom. We are called to integrate all of these dynamisms, because in and of themselves, they each have a kind of different aim, different goal. I mean, our emotions and so on are probably for, well, it depends, fear or anger or pleasure or something like that. And we can be carried off into theory that means nothing, you know. So I would say there's an example of how a transcendental, well, actually several transcendentals, because they're all brought together. First of all, there's the problem of the manyness, the otherness in us. Then there's the problem of the unification, of the unity that is in us. But then that entails a real grasp of our own situation. If I feel that I was really unjust in my smarmy answer to somebody because I was angered and so on, then I have a problem here about my emotions. And so you have then to recognize the truth about yourself, and in doing that you have to also aim at the good that will integrate all of these. So I think you can go through there, and obviously certain persons are, it's too bad we don't have another word for beauty, because I was going to say Mother Teresa was beautiful. But of course, you know, what you mean by beautiful, pretty. So no. But there's some deeper sense. I wish we had another word for pulchrum, another translation for pulchrum. But there was pulchritude there, and not in the usual sense of bathing beauties. There was a real pulchritude there. And so I think all of them are involved in just such an example. Yes.
I have a question about that last comment you made, if I may. I remember going somewhere and being with a group of students and seeing a picture of Mother Teresa. And many people have put up pictures of Mother Teresa. And I said, well, she's very, very beautiful. And they said, well, no, she's very holy, but she's not very beautiful. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I think she's very beautiful. And quite frankly, the fact that so many people find that face radiant, right, and drawn to it in a very powerful way, I suggest, look, I think that's beautiful. I'm not just saying, I don't know if this is a piety towards that. I really think there's beauty there. And I was wondering whether you might make a comment.
I'm glad you defended it, because I'm uneasy. Of course, I take most of my discomfort with the word beauty from looking at abstract art and postmodern art. The better pieces, which have all of the features you just described. But it seems to me that beauty, it's so easy for beauty to be cheapened. The term, I mean, the way, but you're quite right. What you just described was what St. Thomas describes: radiance or claritas, inner proportion and harmony, and integrity or wholeness. Well, if Mother Teresa doesn't have those, I don't know who does. You know, and that's beauty. So I think you're quite right that we are called to go beyond this. There's a paradox here. In one way, beauty charms us at the surface, but it also calls us beyond the surface, I think. In Fides et Ratio, John Paul, when he talks about dialogue, and a dialogue, you know, a friendship can be a beautiful kind of relation itself. And he says we're only required very minimal things. We have to respect the other. We have to go beyond the surface to a deeper level. And we have to expect that something important might come of this. Those are very minimal requirements. And yet, if they're carried out, you can speak of a beautiful conversation. And it really is beautiful. My uneasiness is that the term itself has been so cheapened now, you know. But I haven't been able to find another word for it. You can't go around talking about pulchritude, because that'll get you into trouble. even without the Super Bowl.
metaphysics.